The executive cabin was calm, almost boring, until a black teenager took his seat in 3F. No shouting, no chaos. Just one glance that made the air go cold. Within minutes, he wouldn't be seen as a passenger anymore, but as a threat, and the entire flight would change because of it. Ethan Carter didn't look like someone looking for trouble. He looked like someone trying to disappear. He stood near the boarding line with his violin case pressed gently against his chest, like it was something fragile. Not expensive, not flashy, just important. His backpack was light. His shoulders were not. Every few seconds, his fingers brushed the small inhaler clipped to the side pocket. Not because he needed it yet, because knowing it was there made his breathing slower. Ethan had just finished a small performance at a community arts center. 30 people, folding chairs, soft applause. The kind of night that didn't make headlines, but made rent. He was tired in a quiet way.
The kind of tired that only comes when your body relaxes after holding itself together too long. He just wanted to go home. When he stepped into the executive cabin, he didn't look around. He didn't stare. He didn't smile. He followed the aisle, counted the rows under his breath, and stopped at 3F. Window seat, quiet corner, fewer eyes. He sat down carefully, sliding the violin case under the seat in front of him, like it was something sacred. Then he rested his hands on his thighs and waited. That was his habit. Wait, observe, stay small. Across the aisle, Margaret Whitmore had already decided she didn't like him. She was the kind of woman who arrived early not because she feared being late, but because she expected to be seen. Her coat was tailored. Her hair was sculpted into place. Her scent entered a room before she did. Margaret didn't rush. She paused at her seat, as if the cabin were her living room, and everyone else were guests who hadn't been formally introduced.
She placed her bag down slowly, adjusted the silk scarf around her neck, sat with the posture of someone who had spent a lifetime being deferred to. Then she noticed Ethan, not as a person, as an interruption. Her eyes traveled from the hoodie to the violin case, then to his hands. Calm, still, unbothered. That, somehow, bothered her. She didn't speak right away. She inhaled through her nose, as if the air had changed quality. Ethan felt it before he saw it, that subtle shift, the way silence tightens when someone is about to claim it. He kept his gaze forward. Margaret leaned slightly toward the aisle, not enough to be obvious, just enough to signal attention. A nearby passenger glanced up, then looked away. The cabin was still polite, but politeness has weight, and sometimes it presses down. A flight attendant passed by. Margaret smiled, quick and practiced. "Excuse me," she said softly. "Is this seating arrangement correct?" The attendant checked her tablet, nodded.
"Yes, ma'am."
Margaret didn't raise her voice. She didn't frown. She simply tilted her head. "I was under the impression this cabin was curated." The word landed gently, but it wasn't gentle. The attendant hesitated. "Everyone here has a valid ticket." Margaret's smile thinned. "Of course, I just assumed there were standards." Ethan's fingers tightened against his jeans. Just a little. He had heard this tone before. Not loud, not aggressive, just certain. Certain that something was wrong, certain that he was the something. He shifted slightly in his seat, a quiet adjustment, a subconscious effort to take up less space. The inhaler brushed his palm. He didn't use it, he just held it. Margaret looked back at him now, openly. Not with fear, with calculation. Her eyes moved from his shoes to his hoodie again, then to the violin case. "What is that?" she asked, not to him,
but to the air. Ethan didn't respond. Silence answered instead.
The kind of silence that makes a room complicit. A man 2 rows ahead glanced back, curious. Another passenger followed his gaze. No one said anything. No one wanted to be first. Margaret exhaled, slowly, like patience was something she was offering. "I just want to be sure," she said louder now, "that everyone here belongs." Belongs. Ethan swallowed. He had learned early that belonging was never neutral. It was a gate, a test, a moving target. The flight attendant straightened her posture. "Ma'am, all passengers here are cleared." Margaret gave a soft laugh. Cleared is such a flexible word. That was the moment the air changed. Not because anyone shouted, but because someone had been given permission without being stopped. Ethan felt it like a temperature drop. His heart rate picked up. Not panic yet, just awareness. The kind that comes when your body remembers old lessons. Stay calm. Don't react. Don't escalate. He reached into his pocket and wrapped his fingers around the inhaler, grounding himself. Margaret noticed. Her eyes flicked to the movement. "What was that?" she asked. Ethan froze. "It's just my—" he started, then stopped. Explaining had never helped before. Explaining always sounded like pleading, and pleading invited more questions. "It's medical," the attendant said quickly. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Medical equipment concealed on a flight?" The word concealed hung in the air. Not accusation, but implication. Ethan's breathing became shallow. He pressed his tongue to the roof of his mouth and inhaled slowly through his nose. The cabin was still quiet. Too quiet. This was how it always began. Not with shouting, not with chaos, but with small permissions. Permission to question. Permission to doubt. Permission to look at one person differently. Margaret leaned back in her seat, satisfied for now. She hadn't demanded anything yet. She'd only planted the idea that something was wrong. And the most dangerous thing about silence is that it lets ideas grow without resistance. Around them, passengers returned to their phones, their magazines, their drinks. Life went on. But for Ethan, it had shifted. He was no longer just a passenger. He was now a question. The executive cabin was quiet in the way expensive places always are. Not peaceful, controlled. Soft lighting, low voices. The clink of glass that cost more than most people's dinner. Every movement slowed down, as if noise itself had been priced out of the room. This was not just a section of a plane. It was a system. Here, status traveled faster than truth, and comfort mattered more than clarity. Ethan sat still in seat 3F, back straight, hands folded, breathing measured. He had learned early that stillness was a kind of shield. The quieter he became, the less space he occupied. The less space he occupied, the safer he felt. Around him, people settled into the ritual of privilege. A man loosened his tie and checked his phone. A woman adjusted her scarf and asked for sparkling water. A couple whispered about their connection in Chicago. Everyone here knew how to be comfortable. Everyone here knew how to belong. Ethan knew how to survive. He didn't open his backpack. He didn't touch the violin case again. He kept his eyes forward, focused on nothing. Across the aisle, Margaret Whitmore crossed her legs slowly. She had spent a lifetime in rooms like this, rooms where her presence was expected, rooms where her comfort was assumed. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't make demands, yet. She simply observed. And in this cabin, observation was power. Margaret noticed how Ethan didn't take up space, how he didn't glance around, how he didn't look like someone who expected anything. That alone unsettled her. Power likes mirrors, and Ethan wasn't reflecting it. She adjusted her seatbelt.
The click was sharp in the silence. 2 rows behind them, Olivia Grant paused mid-step. Olivia had been a flight attendant for 12 years. She knew how to read a room before a word was spoken. She could sense turbulence before the seatbelt sign turned on. She felt it now. Not panic, not danger. Tension. The kind that lived in posture, in eye contact, in the way a voice was about to rise without warning. She glanced at Ethan, then at Margaret, then at the passengers watching without wanting to look. This was how things started. Not with shouting, but with imbalance. Up front, Captain Harris checked his instruments. He was a man of procedures, checklists, order. In his world, truth was something you verified, not something you felt. He trusted systems, he trusted protocols. He trusted the idea that structure kept chaos away. What he didn't see was how structure could protect the wrong person. Back on the cabin floor, Ethan's foot tapped once against the carpet. Not from impatience, from grounding. He stopped himself immediately. Even small movements felt dangerous now. Margaret leaned toward the aisle again, subtle and deliberate. She didn't look at Ethan when she spoke.
"I assume security is thorough these days," she said.
It sounded like casual conversation, but it wasn't. It was a test. A nearby passenger looked up, then another. Olivia slowed her walk. She didn't stop yet. She waited. Because stopping too early could turn concern into conflict. That was the dance. Ethan felt his shoulders tighten. The inhaler was still in his pocket, still untouched, still close. Margaret folded her hands in her lap. Perfect posture, perfect composure.
"Things just aren't the way they used to be,"
she added. A man across the aisle nodded slightly, not in agreement, but not in disagreement either, and silence filled the rest. This was the executive cabin as a society. No laws spoken, no rules posted, just signals. Who could question? Who could be questioned? Who would be protected if things turned uncomfortable? Ethan looked like uncertainty. Margaret looked like authority. And authority always moved first. 3,000 feet above the ground, in the operations control hub, Samuel Carter leaned over a glowing screen. He had been working 12-hour shifts for years. The job demanded it. Planes didn't care about birthdays. Storms didn't pause for family dinners. Airspace didn't sleep. Samuel's world was numbers and trajectories, dots moving on a grid, lives reduced to signals. But every signal mattered. He adjusted his headset and responded to a routine call. Confirmed. Maintain altitude. His voice was steady. It always was. He had learned to keep emotion out of his tone. Emotion had no place in air traffic. What he didn't know was that one of those dots carried his son. Back in the cabin, Olivia finally stepped forward. She smiled professionally. Warm, neutral, controlled.
"Is everything all right here?"
she asked. Margaret smiled back. A mirror smile, polite and sharp.
"Of course. I was just making conversation."
Conversation. That word had weight in this space. Conversation could open doors. Conversation could close them. Ethan remained silent, not because he had nothing to say, because speaking had never made things better before. The executive cabin was not dangerous because of violence. It was dangerous because of permission. Permission to assume, permission to doubt, permission to watch someone else be questioned
while you stayed comfortable. Everyone in this cabin had a role. Margaret was the voice of entitlement, confident enough to bend the room. Olivia was the gatekeeper, trained to calm, not confront. Captain Harris was the guardian of procedure, focused on systems, not stories. And Ethan was the variable.
The one the system didn't know how to hold. He shifted his weight slightly, a small movement, but Margaret noticed. Her eyes followed the motion. "Is he okay?" she asked. Again, not to him, to the space. The question floated, and no one caught it. This was how a society chose sides without saying a word. Not by shouting, not by force, but by watching who was allowed to be comfortable and who was asked to explain themselves. Margaret didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She leaned back in her seat and crossed her arms, like a woman settling in to watch something unfold. "I just think it's responsible," she said calmly, "to be aware of what people are carrying." The word people lingered in the air. Ethan felt his chest tighten. He kept his eyes forward. Olivia stood still for a second, too long to be neutral, too short to be decisive. "Ma'am, everything on board is screened," she said. Margaret smiled, small, controlled. "Of course." But screening isn't the same as certainty. A man 2 rows ahead shifted in his seat. "What exactly is he carrying?" he asked, not curious, concerned. Ethan's fingers curled against his knees. "My violin," he said quietly. The word barely traveled past his lips. Margaret tilted her head. "And the device in your pocket?" Ethan froze. The inhaler pressed against his thigh like a warning. "It's medical," Olivia said quickly. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "So, you admit there is a device?" That was all it took. Not proof, not danger. Just a sentence shaped like suspicion. A woman near the window leaned toward her husband. "Why would someone need medical equipment on a flight?" she whispered, loud enough to be heard. The man in front of Ethan turned halfway around. "Maybe we should let security take a look," he said. The cabin shifted, not physically, socially. Ethan could feel it in the way eyes lingered longer now, in the way bodies leaned back slightly,
In the way distance was being created, without anyone standing up. Olivia raised her hands slightly, the way people do when they want calm but don't yet have authority.
"Let's slow down," she said. "There's no indication of any threat."
Margaret exhaled slowly.
"That's what people always say before something happens."
Another passenger nodded. Fear didn't need evidence. It only needed permission. Ethan's breathing became uneven. He reached for the inhaler. The movement was small, but in that moment, it was explosive.
"What is he doing?" someone asked.
"He's grabbing something," another voice said. "It could be a trigger," the man 2 rows up muttered. Olivia stepped closer.
"Ethan, please keep your hands visible."
The way she said it mattered. Not aggressive, but not equal either. Ethan lifted his hands slowly. Open, empty. The inhaler slipped from his pocket and rolled onto the carpet. Plastic, white, harmless. But no one rushed to pick it up.
Margaret stared at it like it was a verdict.
"That," she said softly, "is exactly what I was talking about."
Olivia bent down and picked it up. She recognized it immediately.
"It's a medical inhaler," she said, "for anxiety."
Margaret's eyes narrowed.
"So he's unstable."
The word landed hard. Ethan shook his head.
"It helps me breathe," he said.
The man in front scoffed. "Then why does he need it now?"
Ethan didn't answer. Because breathing wasn't just about lungs, it was about safety. And safety had just been removed from the room. Olivia hesitated. That hesitation was everything. Because in that pause, the system chose not to speak. Back on the operations control hub floor, a small notification appeared on a screen. Passenger flagged, Ethan Carter. Reason, suspicious item reported. The system ran its check. Clear. No threat detected. No prohibited devices. Medical equipment confirmed. The message was clean, precise, final. But it stayed on the screen, waiting. Back in the cabin, Margaret had already moved past logic. "I'm not comfortable," she said, "and I think others feel the same." The woman near the window nodded quickly. "Yes, I do." That made two. The man too rose up, stood slightly, just enough to be seen. "We can't take chances," he said. That made three. Now it wasn't one voice, it was a chorus. Ethan felt his heart pounding in his ears. He pressed his back into the seat like it might protect him. Olivia's radio buzzed softly at her hip. She didn't answer it yet. She was watching the cabin, and the cabin was no longer hers. This was the moment the system failed, not because it didn't have data, but because it didn't use it. The operations control hub had already cleared Ethan. The AI had already spoken, but the room had chosen a different truth. Margaret leaned forward. "I don't understand why we're even debating this," she said. "If there's any doubt, he should be removed. That's just common sense." Common sense.
The most dangerous phrase in moments like this. Because it didn't need rules. It didn't need proof. It only needed agreement. Olivia finally spoke into her radio, requesting security verification in executive cabin. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were uncertain. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, not in fear, in exhaustion. He had done nothing, and yet everything was happening. The man in front turned fully now. "Why is he even traveling alone?" he asked. That question had nothing to do with safety. It had everything to do with belonging. Margaret watched the cabin respond, not with panic, with alignment. This was no longer her accusation. It was theirs. When the system stays quiet, the loudest voice becomes law. When procedures hesitate, prejudice steps forward. When no one corrects the story becomes truth. This wasn't chaos. It was organization around fear. Ethan felt small, not because he was weak, but because the room had grown powerful against him. Two security officers appeared at the entrance of the cabin. The cabin went silent. Not shocked, relieved. Relief is what fear feels like when it finds authority. They approached slowly. "Sir," one of them said, "we need you to stand up." Ethan's hands trembled as he gripped the armrests. He stood. The room watched. Margaret sat back, composed. She had not touched him. She had not yelled. She had not lied. She had only guided the story, and the system had followed. Back in the operations control hub, the clearance message still glowed. No threat detected. But no one had acknowledged it yet, because systems don't act on truth automatically. They act on what people choose to hear. And right now, the cabin had chosen fear. 300 miles away, the operations control hub was quiet in the way only high-pressure rooms ever are. Not calm, controlled. Rows of screens glowed in soft blues and greens. Flight paths, security logs, passenger reports. Data moving faster than any human emotion ever could. Samuel Carter stood with a tablet in his hand,
scanning alerts with the same discipline he had practiced for 25 years. Straight posture, measured breathing, no wasted motion. He wasn't looking for anything personal, he never did, until one line made his eyes stop. Passenger flagged, Ethan Carter, executive cabin, security concern reported. His thumb hovered over the screen. He read it again. Ethan Carter. The name didn't echo, it didn't shout. It landed, quietly. He tapped into the report. Age 17, seat 3F. Item, suspected device. Samuel's jaw tightened. He scrolled. AI assessment. No threat detected. Medical equipment confirmed. Risk level 0. Clear. Definitive. Unambiguous. His hand didn't move, because names change the weight of information. Another controller glanced over. Everything good, Sam? Samuel didn't answer right away.
He zoomed in on the passenger details. Home address, emergency contact, his own number. His chest expanded sharply like air had been pushed into it all at once. He didn't sit. He didn't speak. He stood completely still. Ethan. His son. The same kid who had texted him 3 hours earlier. Landing tonight. I'll be home soon. Samuel closed his eyes once. Just once. Then he moved. Pull the live feed from executive cabin security, he said. His voice was even. Too even. The technician complied. The screen shifted, and there was Ethan, standing, hands visible, surrounded by uniforms. Not resisting, not arguing, just existing inside suspicion. Samuel's jaw clenched. The system had cleared him. The data had cleared him, and yet, here he was. Why is he being detained? Samuel asked. The technician checked. Passenger complaint escalated. Multiple confirmations. Cabin security responded. Based on what evidence? The technician paused. Perception of risk. Daniel exhaled slowly through his nose. Perception, not proof, not protocol, not process. Perception. He leaned closer to the screen. Ethan's shoulders were tight, his breathing uneven. Samuel recognized it immediately. Panic. The kind his son got when rooms turned hostile. The kind that came from being watched too closely, from being misunderstood too often. Samuel straightened. Open the full decision chain, he said. The timeline appeared. Complaint filed, AI clearance returned, no follow-up action. Security dispatched anyway. The room shifted, not physically, but in attention. People began to look at Samuel. They didn't know yet, but they felt something change. He didn't say his name. He didn't need to. Why was the AI clearance ignored? He asked. Silence. The technician glanced at another supervisor. Cabin pressure, sir. Multiple passengers expressing concern. Samuel nodded once. So fear overrode fact. No one corrected him. He turned back to the screen. Ethan was being asked to move, slowly, carefully, like he was carrying something dangerous instead of being one. Samuel pressed the comm button. Hold position, he said into the channel. This is Samuel Carter, Operations Control Director. The cabin feed flickered. Olivia Grant's voice came through. Copy, Director Carter. Why is a cleared passenger being restrained? There was a pause, the kind that only happens when the truth has nowhere comfortable to stand. Passenger concerns escalated the situation, Olivia said carefully. Concerns override clearance now? Samuel asked. No, sir. Then release him. Silence again. Margaret's voice was faint in the background. I don't feel safe until he's removed. Samuel's eyes hardened. This is not a popularity contest, he said. It's a system, and systems run on evidence. He turned to the room. Every second we delay, we teach people that fear is enough to rewrite truth. No one disagreed.
But no one moved yet. Samuel's voice lowered. Let me ask a harder question. The room leaned in without realizing it. If this boy weren't my son, would we be having this conversation right now? No one answered, because everyone knew the answer. Samuel pressed the channel again. Stand down, he said. Release the passenger immediately. He is cleared. That is final. Olivia exhaled audibly. Yes, sir. The security officers hesitated, then stepped back. Ethan didn't move at first. He didn't trust the change. Samuel watched him carefully. This was the part that hurt the most. Not the accusation, not the delay, but the doubt that freedom would actually come. Samuel leaned closer to the mic. Ethan, he said softly. The cabin went still. Ethan looked up. The sound of his father's voice cut through the noise like a memory. Yes, he said. Samuel closed his eyes briefly. You're okay. Stay where you are. You're safe. Ethan swallowed. The security officer stepped aside.
The invisible weight in the cabin shifted.
Not relief. Recalibration. Margaret stiffened. This is unbelievable, she said. Samuel heard her clearly. Actually, he replied, this is exactly what systems are for. He straightened. And now comes the part that matters. He paused. Because if my son needed his father's authority to be treated as a human being, the room froze. Then something is deeply broken. The technicians stopped typing. The supervisors stopped moving. Samuel continued. We cannot build justice on bloodlines. We cannot build safety on who someone knows. He looked back at the screen. Ethan was sitting again, breathing slowly, alive in his dignity. Samuel's voice remained steady. The real question isn't how fast I could step in. It's how many times this has happened when no one could. The room absorbed that, and the system, for the first time, felt seen. Samuel wasn't just correcting a mistake. He was exposing a dependence, one no one liked to admit. Because power should never be a family privilege, and justice should never wait for a father's voice to arrive. Margaret Whitmore didn't sit the same way anymore. Before, she had been composed, spine straight, chin lifted, like the cabin belonged to her. Now her shoulders were tight. Her fingers curled around the armrest. Her foot tapped against the carpet once, twice, too fast for comfort. She glanced toward Ethan, then away, then back again. Not with anger, with calculation. The kind people use when control starts slipping. This is being handled poorly, she said, louder than necessary. Her voice tried to sound calm. It failed. A flight attendant shifted uncomfortably. Passengers leaned in, pretending not to listen. Margaret adjusted her silk scarf. Her hand shook just slightly. She hated that. I paid for safety, she continued. I expect professionalism. Her words hung in the air.
But the cabin wasn't moving the way it had before. Earlier, her voice had been a command. Now, it was a request pretending to be one. Ethan sat quietly, hands on his knees, breathing slow. He wasn't trying to prove anything, and somehow that made her more unsettled. Margaret cleared her throat. "I still don't feel comfortable," she said. "Something about this whole situation feels wrong." No one answered. That silence was new. She looked around, waiting for agreement, for backup. 2 rows ahead, a man who had nodded earlier avoided her eyes. A woman near the aisle stared at her phone, too focused. Margaret swallowed. She wasn't being supported anymore. She was being watched. Her grip tightened on her bag. "This is unacceptable," she said, sharper now. "My husband would never allow this kind of oversight." No reaction. The words landed flat. Margaret shifted in her seat. She had expected authority to echo. Instead, it had thudded. She tried again. "I don't feel safe." The phrase had worked before. It was supposed to work now. But the cabin didn't lean toward her. It leaned toward stillness, toward listening, toward Ethan. She frowned. This was not how power was supposed to behave. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "This is how tragedies happen," she said, "when warning signs are ignored." Her voice wavered at the end. That wasn't planned. Her eyes flicked toward the exit sign above the aisle. Bright, unmoving. The cabin lights reflected in her pupils. For the first time, Margaret felt small, not threatened, not attacked, exposed. Her status had always been armor. Now it felt thin. She crossed her arms, uncrossed them, crossed them again. "Someone needs to take responsibility," she said. Her words had lost their certainty. Responsibility was no longer automatically hers to define. Ethan didn't look at her. He didn't need to. The shift was happening without him. Margaret noticed.
And panic, quiet but sharp, pressed against her ribs. She leaned back. She thought wealth was permanence. She thought influence was gravity. But gravity only works when people believe in it. She glanced at the crew. They were standing straighter now, not toward her, toward protocol. That scared her. She had always known how to speak to people, how to guide conversations, how to make her concerns become decisions. But now, her words were being weighed, measured, not obeyed. "This is absurd," she whispered. Her voice cracked slightly. No one corrected her. No one comforted her. She felt the room change temperature, not physically, socially. The air had turned colder, and she was no longer its source. Margaret pulled her phone from her purse, then paused. Who would she call? Power feels infinite until it needs a witness. She placed the phone back. Her breathing quickened. The image she carried of herself began to fracture, not publicly, internally. She had always believed she stood above chaos, but now she was inside it, and it didn't care about her history. She glanced toward Ethan again, not with hatred, with disbelief. How could someone so quiet unravel her certainty? Not because he was strong, but because he refused to perform fear. She looked at her own hands. They were trembling, just slightly. She pressed them together. Margaret had never considered herself cruel. She thought of herself as discerning, protective, cautious. She didn't see herself as someone who hurt people. She saw herself as someone who protected order. But now, order was standing without her permission, and that terrified her. She inhaled sharply. "This is getting out of hand," she muttered.
but no one asked her what she meant. Her authority had dissolved into noise. The cabin didn't need her approval anymore. She shifted again, uncomfortable, exposed. This wasn't rage. This was fear. Fear of being irrelevant.
Fear of being questioned. Fear of being seen without the layers she'd built her life on. Margaret wasn't losing control because she was weak. She was losing control because control was all she had. And now, it wasn't listening. She had spent years defining herself by contrast. Better than, above, safer than. But Ethan didn't compete. He existed. And that made her definitions useless. Her throat tightened. She adjusted her bracelet, a habit, a signal of confidence she'd practiced for decades. It didn't work this time. The room was no longer responding to posture. It was responding to truth, and truth doesn't bow. Margaret leaned back, her face pale. This wasn't about security anymore. This was about identity. About what happens when someone realizes that their place in the world isn't guaranteed, that their value isn't enforced, that their voice is not a command, but a request. And sometimes, not even that. She looked smaller now, not physically, socially. Because the power she relied on had always come from belief. And belief had just expired. Margaret wasn't witnessing justice. She was witnessing her own disappearance from the center of the room. Not because she was punished, but because she was no longer necessary. And that was the moment she finally understood. Cruelty doesn't always come from strength. Sometimes it comes from terror. The terror of becoming invisible. The terror of realizing that without titles, without wealth, without automatic respect, you are just another person. And that truth is unbearable to someone who has never learned how to be ordinary. Ethan stayed seated after everything settled, not because he was calm, because his body was tired of being alert. His shoulders dropped slightly, not in relief, in exhaustion. The cabin had quieted, but it wasn't peaceful. It was reflective, like a room that had just realized what it was capable of. Olivia stood nearby, hands folded in front of her.
She looked at Ethan, then at the floor, then back at him again.
"Are you okay?" she asked softly. Ethan nodded once, not confidently, not convincingly. "I'm fine," he said. People say that when they don't want to explain how not fine they actually are. The man who had suggested security earlier shifted in his seat. He cleared his throat. He didn't apologize. He didn't look back. But his posture had changed. Smaller. Careful. Ethan noticed. He always noticed. That was the part no one talked about. How people like him learn to read rooms before rooms ever read them. He didn't feel strong. He felt placed. Placed in a moment that wasn't built to protect him. Samuel's voice came through the cabin one last time. "Everything is resolved. Thank you for your cooperation." The call ended, and the silence that followed was different. Not tension. Responsibility. Ethan rested his head back against the seat. His breathing slowed. Not because the danger was gone, but because the system had finally chosen him. For the first time on that flight, he wasn't surviving alone. People love stories where someone stands up for themselves, where courage looks loud, where strength looks like confrontation. But that wasn't what had saved Ethan. He didn't shout, he didn't argue, he didn't overpower anyone. He simply existed. And someone with authority decided that was enough. That's the truth people struggle to accept. You can be brave, you can be kind, you can be careful, and still be unsafe. Not because you failed, but because the environment failed you. Ethan wasn't weak when he froze. He wasn't fragile when his breathing changed. He wasn't cowardly when his voice shook. He was in a place where his safety depended on strangers, and strangers don't always choose fairly. The cabin didn't protect him at first. The rules didn't protect him at first. The system didn't protect him at first. And that wasn't a personal flaw.
That was a structural one. People watching stories like this often think, I would have spoken up. I would have been stronger. I wouldn't let that happen to me. But strength doesn't mean much in a room that's already decided who belongs. Courage can't survive without support. Confidence collapses when there's no one to confirm it. Ethan didn't need to become powerful. The room needed to become accountable. That's the difference. Back in the cabin, Olivia finally stepped closer. Again, I'm sorry, she said. This time, it wasn't protocol. It was human. Ethan looked up at her. It's okay, he said. But his voice carried something else, understanding. He understood how systems hesitate, how people wait, how fairness is slow when fear is fast. He understood that he wasn't alone in this. He was just earlier. People like him always are. The woman near the aisle finally spoke. I didn't know, she said quietly. Ethan didn't answer, because knowing comes late. Protection is what matters. The cabin had learned something it didn't expect to. That justice isn't automatic. It's constructed. That silence doesn't mean neutrality. It means absence. And absence always has a cost. Ethan adjusted his grip on his violin case. Not tightly, steadily. It was the one thing in the room that had never changed its purpose. Music didn't judge. It didn't ask permission. It didn't choose sides. It simply existed, like he did. People think strength looks like standing tall, but sometimes strength is being allowed to sit down, to breathe, to remain human. Ethan didn't need to be braver. He needed a world that didn't demand bravery just to be respected. That's what justice actually is. Not luck, not intervention, not coincidence. Justice is a system that doesn't make survival feel heroic. Justice is a room where you don't have to prove you deserve to be safe. Ethan hadn't changed. The system had. And that's the only change that ever truly matters. Margaret never looked at Ethan again, not because she had learned something, but because she couldn't face what she had done. Her eyes stayed fixed on the window. The clouds outside moved slowly, peacefully, as if nothing had happened. Her hands stayed tight around her purse, white knuckles, rigid shoulders. She looked smaller now, not humbled, contained. Ethan noticed. He always noticed. He could have stared back, could have held her gaze, could have waited for an apology that never came. He didn't. He turned slightly in his seat and opened his violin case, slowly, carefully. The sound of the latches was soft, almost polite. It wasn't a statement. It was a choice. He wasn't interested in carrying her with him. People think forgiveness is something you give to someone else. It's not. It's something you take back for yourself. Ethan lifted the violin and rested it across his lap. Not to play, just to hold. His fingers traced the smooth wood. A familiar weight, a familiar calm. Margaret sat frozen. Not because she felt guilt, because guilt would require courage. She felt exposed, stripped of authority, reduced to a person who had made a mistake in public, and she didn't know how to exist without being right. Ethan didn't need her to understand. He didn't need her regret.
He didn't need her apology. He didn't need her permission to move forward. He just needed to breathe without her shadow. That was forgiveness. Not reconciliation, not forgetting, not excusing. Releasing. Letting the weight fall where it belonged. Back on the plane, a flight attendant passed by and paused. "Would you like anything?" she asked. Ethan shook his head. "No, thank you." His voice was steady. Not proud, not bitter. Just done. Margaret shifted again. She wanted to speak. She didn't. Her silence wasn't humility. It was fear. Fear that if she spoke, she would have to admit she was wrong. Fear that without her position, she had nothing else to stand on. People often think the victim holds the power of forgiveness. But real power is choosing not to let pain define your future. Ethan wasn't erasing what happened. He was deciding where it would end. Not in his hands. Not in his heart. Not in his story. Forgiveness isn't saying, "You're okay." It's saying, "I'm done letting you shape who I become." Ethan closed the violin case gently. Click. That sound was quieter than everything else that had happened, but it was stronger. Margaret finally glanced sideways. Just once. She saw Ethan looking forward, not at her, past her. She opened her mouth, then closed it. She had lost her audience, and for someone like her, that was the real punishment. Ethan didn't win by humiliating her. He didn't win by exposing her. He won by refusing to carry her with him. That's the part people miss.
Forgiveness isn't soft. It isn't weak. It isn't passive. It is one of the most disciplined acts a person can make. It requires boundaries. It requires clarity. It requires the decision that your peace is more important than your anger. Ethan sat back. His breathing was even, not forced, not controlled, natural, like his body had finally been given permission to rest. Margaret sat stiff, trapped inside her own pride. Two people in the same cabin. One was free, one wasn't. People love revenge stories because they feel fair, but revenge keeps you connected to the person who hurt you. Forgiveness cuts the cord. Ethan didn't need to punish Margaret. The system would do that. The consequences would come. But they wouldn't live in him. That was the difference. Forgiveness wasn't kindness toward her. It was loyalty to himself. He wasn't going to let her words echo in his future. He wasn't going to let her fear become his memory. He wasn't going to let her mistake define his worth. Margaret had already taken enough. She didn't get to take his peace, too. The cabin settled into a quiet that felt earned, not forced, not tense, real. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, not to escape, to choose. To choose calm, to choose movement, to choose a life that didn't revolve around what had happened. That's forgiveness. Not an apology accepted, not a past erased, a future protected. And Ethan had already moved on. The consequences didn't arrive with sirens or shouting. They came quietly, in the form of reports, recordings, timelines that couldn't be rewritten. Margaret was escorted off the plane after landing, not by force, but by procedure. 2 officers, calm voices, no raised hands. She tried to walk with dignity. Her heels clicked too fast. Her posture leaned forward, like someone trying to outrun what was already decided. Back in the cabin, passengers whispered, not about Ethan, about her. That was the first shift. For the first time, she wasn't the voice people followed. She was the name being questioned. 3 hours later, her statement was logged.
Her words were compared against audio. Her accusations were matched with security scans. Nothing aligned. Not one. She had claimed suspicious behavior. The AI showed steady breathing patterns. She had claimed unauthorized equipment. The scans showed a violin and a medical inhaler. She had claimed aggressive posture. The footage showed a teenager sitting still, hands folded, eyes down. Data doesn't argue. It only exposes. And this time, it didn't protect her. Margaret wasn't charged because she was mean. She was charged because she caused measurable damage. Federal aviation law doesn't care about tone. It cares about outcomes. And her outcome was panic, delays, emergency protocol activation, a flight treated like a threat scenario. That is a crime.
Inciting panic on an aircraft is not an opinion. It is an offense. False reporting of a security threat is not a misunderstanding. It is a federal violation. For years, Margaret had used confidence like a signature. Now her name was attached to a file number. That's how power changes hands. Not through shouting, through documentation. But the real consequence didn't belong to her. It belonged to the system. Because the system had made a decision before the law ever did. It had chosen her voice over its own data. The AI had cleared Ethan. The scan had cleared Ethan. The protocol had cleared Ethan. And yet, everything moved forward anyway, because someone important felt uncomfortable. That was the failure. Not a person, a pattern. The Operations Review Board saw it immediately. A timeline where human bias outran verified information. A chain where authority overrode evidence. No malfunction, no glitch. A preference. Margaret didn't break the system. She revealed what the system already tolerated. A week later, an internal bulletin was sent across multiple departments. Short, cold, unapologetic. Passenger status must not override verified threat assessments. Deviation from AI security conclusions requires documented cause. Verbal accusations alone are insufficient for protocol escalation. That sentence meant everything. It admitted the truth without saying her name. They had trusted power more than proof. That's not a mistake. That's culture. And cultures don't change from apologies. They change from embarrassment. The airline faced investigation, not for what Margaret said, but for why her words worked. They had built a system that listened selectively. A system that reacted faster to privilege than to precision. That is a design flaw. Ethan wasn't the only one watching. Every employee read that bulletin. Pilots, security, cabin staff.
And suddenly, a new question lived in their routines. Am I reacting to risk or to reputation? That's the moment justice becomes structural. Not when one person falls, but when the ladder itself is examined. Margaret faced charges, but the airline faced reform, and that's heavier. Because reform means admitting that harm didn't come from a single woman. It came from what they allowed her to represent. She had been treated as a shortcut, a trusted signal, a voice that required no verification. That trust was misplaced. And the system had to own it, publicly. Quietly, the AI protocols were updated. Human overrides now required written justification. Training sessions were revised. Bias response drills were added. No announcements, no headlines, just changes. That's what real accountability looks like. Not dramatic, not emotional, permanent. Margaret lost her illusion of control. The system lost its illusion of neutrality.
Only one of those losses made things safer. People like to believe justice is about punishment. It's not. Punishment closes a chapter. Reform
rewrites the book. Margaret's story ended in a courtroom. Ethan's story changed policy. That difference matters, because the goal was never to destroy her. It was to make sure someone like her couldn't do this again. And that's when justice stops being personal and starts being protective. Not about revenge, about prevention. The cabin had returned to silence hours ago, but somewhere deeper, something had finally been corrected. Not a person, a direction. A system that had leaned toward power had been forced to lean toward proof. And that shift would outlive everyone on that flight. Ethan didn't become louder after the flight. He didn't start speaking in interviews. He didn't post statements. He didn't try to turn pain into a performance. He went home. He unpacked his violin. He wiped the fingerprints off the case.
He placed it gently on the edge of his bed, like he always did. The world had changed around him, but his ritual stayed the same. That was his power. Not reaction, not revenge. Consistency. The next evening, he stood in the small rehearsal room at his school. The walls were scratched with years of forgotten concerts. The floor still smelled faintly of dust and old rosin. He adjusted the shoulder rest, checked the strings, drew the bow across once, slow and quiet. The sound filled the room. Not dramatic, not defiant, just honest. Music didn't ask him to explain anything. It didn't ask him to justify his existence. It didn't ask him to be less threatening or more acceptable. It just responded. Ethan had never played to prove he belonged. He played because it was the one place he didn't have to ask permission to exist. Back on that plane, his silence had been mistaken for weakness. Here, his quiet became precision. Each note was deliberate, each pause intentional. He wasn't performing for an audience. He was restoring himself. That's what dignity looks like when it doesn't need applause. A week later, the school auditorium filled quietly. No banners, no press, just parents, students, and a few teachers who had heard him practice through thin walls. Ethan walked onto the stage with his violin tucked under his arm. No spotlight, no introduction. He adjusted the mic stand without using it. He didn't need amplification. The first note landed softly, then another, then a line that rose and fell like breath. People leaned forward, not because of who he was, but because of what he carried. The music wasn't angry, it wasn't fragile, it was steady. And that steadiness made something shift in the room. This wasn't a victim performing survival. This was a young man choosing presence. His bow moved with control. His shoulders stayed relaxed, his expression calm. Every note said the same thing. I am not here to explain myself. Somewhere in the back, a teacher wiped her eyes without realizing it. A student lowered their phone and just listened. Because what Ethan was offering wasn't a story. It was grounding. In a world that kept asking people to justify their worth, he was reminding them that worth doesn't ask. After the final note, there was silence. Not the tense kind, the respectful kind. Then applause. Not explosive, not forced, earned. Ethan bowed once, not deeply, not proudly, just enough to say, "Thank you." And then he left the stage. No speech, no message. He didn't need to summarize what the music had already done. People often expect survivors to become symbols, to speak, to represent, to carry meaning for everyone else. Ethan refused that role quietly. He chose something better. He chose to be a source of calm instead of a reference point for pain. That's what made him powerful, not because he stood taller, but because he stood unchanged. The world wanted him to react.
He chose to remain. Weeks later, his father watched a recording of that performance in the control hub break room. No one said anything. They just let it play. The room stayed quiet, not because of rules, because of respect. Samuel didn't smile. He didn't speak. He just sat back and breathed, not with relief, with recognition. His son hadn't been protected by force. He had protected himself by refusing to be reshaped. That's something systems can't control. That's something power can't own. People talk about strength like it has to be loud, like it has to confront, like it has to dominate. But Ethan showed a different kind. The kind that doesn't bend. The kind that doesn't chase validation. The kind that doesn't need permission. He wasn't trying to shine. He was trying to live truthfully. And that made him light. Not a spotlight. A steady glow. Something that doesn't blind. Something that guides. In every room he entered afterward, something softened. Not because of fear. Because of presence. People spoke a little quieter. They moved a little slower. They listened a little longer. Not because they knew his story, but because they felt his balance. Ethan didn't become a headline. He became a reminder. That dignity doesn't announce itself. It shows up. That art isn't a protest. It's a declaration of existence. That you don't need to raise your voice to be unshakable. Some people use power to command space. Ethan used authenticity to hold it. And the difference was unmistakable. He wasn't a victim who survived. He was a person who remained whole. That's not recovery. That's sovereignty. When people asked him later how he felt about the incident, he didn't give them what they expected. He said, "I'm practicing." That was it. Not justice, not anger, not closure. Practice. Because for him, healing wasn't a moment. It was a rhythm. And every time he lifted that violin, he chose himself again. Quietly, fully, without asking the world to agree. A good society is not one where people have to be brave just to be treated like human beings. It's not one where you need a powerful last name or a badge or someone in a control room who recognizes your face. A good society is one where protection is automatic, where dignity doesn't depend on who is watching. What happened to Ethan wasn't rare. It was just visible. It happens in hospitals, in classrooms, in stores, in offices, in small moments where someone is judged before they are understood. And most of the time, it doesn't grow because people are cruel. It grows because people stay quiet. Silence doesn't always mean agreement, but systems treat it that way. Every time someone looks away, every time someone says, "It's not my place,"
Every time someone waits for someone else to speak first, that space becomes permission. You don't need to be a hero to change that. You don't need a microphone. You don't need authority. Sometimes all it takes is a pause, a question, a calm, steady, "Is that really what's happening here?" That's not confrontation. That's responsibility. Because justice isn't dramatic most of the time. It's quiet. It's uncomfortable. It's inconvenient. But it's also contagious. When one person refuses to accept a wrong moment as normal, others follow. Not loudly, naturally. We talk a lot about strength, but real strength isn't dominance. It's presence. It's the ability to stay aware when it would be easier to stay detached. To stay human when the system becomes mechanical. Ethan didn't ask to be strong. He just wanted to go home. And that's the point.
No one should have to be exceptional just to be safe. No one should have to prove their innocence through pain. No one should have to carry grace to survive someone else's fear. A good society doesn't wait for victims to become symbols. It prevents victims from being created. So the question isn't, what would you do in a crisis? The question is simpler. What do you do in the small moments? When someone is being dismissed, when someone is being labeled, when silence is easier than truth. That's where systems are shaped, not by power, by participation. If this story made you uncomfortable, that's not a flaw. That's awareness starting. If it made you think of a moment you stayed quiet, that's not guilt. That's growth waiting. You don't have to be loud. You don't have to be perfect. Just don't be absent. Because a society where people don't have to be strong to be human is built by people who refuse to be silent when humanity is missing.